The moment your well starts sucking air instead of water, you stop asking questions about the weather and start asking who is stealing your future. The sound woke me at 4:12 in the morning. Not an alarm, not a phone call. A low mechanical groan rolling through the walls of my ranch house. I sat up in bed and listened. The pump was running again, for the third time that week. That alone was strange. My groundwater system had operated almost flawlessly for years. I pulled on a pair of jeans and stepped outside into the cool darkness. The air smelled like dry grass and dust. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a coyote barked once and then disappeared into the silence. The pump house sat about 200 yards from my back porch. Its security light cast a pale circle across the gravel. As I approached, the sound grew louder. The pump was working harder than it should have been. Much harder. I opened the metal door and immediately felt something was wrong. The pressure gauge was lower than normal. Not dangerously low, just low enough to bother someone who understood water systems. Someone like me. I checked the controls twice. Then a third time. Everything appeared functional. No leaks. No electrical issues. No broken equipment. Yet the numbers refused to make sense. By sunrise, I was standing beside the main while holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The horizon glowed orange across hundreds of acres of ranch land my family had owned for generations. Usually that view calmed me. That morning it did not. I spent the next several days reviewing logs from monitoring equipment installed throughout the property. The deeper I looked, the worse things became. Groundwater levels were dropping faster than historical averages. Pump cycles were increasing. Energy consumption was rising. Something was putting stress on the aquifer beneath my land. At first, I blamed drought conditions. Texas had seen worse. Then I compared recent measurements against records going back nearly 20 years. The pattern did not match natural decline. This was different. This was acceleration. One afternoon, I called a colleague who specialized in groundwater modeling. We met at a diner outside town. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the room while farmers discussed crop prices in nearby booths. I slid the data across the table. He studied the reports for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. Finally, he looked up. His expression had changed. "Cole," he said quietly, "if these numbers are accurate, somebody is pulling a tremendous amount of water from the same source." I laughed, not because it was funny, because I already knew what sat less than 3 miles from my property. 80 newly built houses, perfect green lawns, decorative ponds, community pools, irrigation systems. Everything managed by the most powerful homeowners association in the county. The same development that had expanded every year since construction began. The same development whose president loved talking about growth. That night I stood outside beside the well as darkness settled across the ranch. The pump started again. The motor strained against the quiet. Beneath my boots, thousands of years of stored groundwater rested inside the aquifer below. Or at least it had. For the first time, I began to suspect that what looked like a neighborhood on the surface might actually be a giant straw buried underground. The aquifer beneath my ranch was older than every fence, road, and house in the county. Long before developers arrived with glossy brochures and promises of growth, that underground reservoir had quietly sustained generations of families, farms, and wildlife. My grandfather used to call it our hidden inheritance. As a kid, I never understood what he meant. Water came out of the faucet. Cattle drank from troughs. Crops survived the summer heat. Everything seemed normal. Only later did I learn how rare that kind of reliability really was. The first well on our property was drilled in the late 1950s. My grandfather kept every record, every maintenance report, every geological survey, every permit. He believed that if you depended on something, you had a responsibility to understand it. After he passed away, those records became mine. Most people inherit land. I inherited an education in groundwater management. By the time I finished college and became a hydrogeologist, I knew that aquifers could not simply be replaced once they were damaged. Rainfall might recharge them. Time might restore them. But neither happened quickly. Some underground water systems took decades to recover. Others took centuries. That knowledge made the numbers from my monitoring equipment even harder to ignore. 2 days after meeting my colleague at the diner, I spent an entire afternoon reviewing historical groundwater data. The smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee inside my office, while sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking the pasture. I compared recent measurements against records from drought years, flood years, and everything in between. The trend was unmistakable. Something had changed. Not gradually. Suddenly. Around the same time the large housing development reached full occupancy, I walked outside near sunset carrying a folder of reports. The ranch stretched across hundreds of acres beneath a sky painted orange and purple. Wind moved gently through the grass. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of irrigation equipment from neighboring properties. Then I looked toward the horizon where the subdivision sat. Even from miles away, I could see rows of rooftops reflecting the last light of the day. 80 homes, perfect lawns, community amenities, decorative landscaping, swimming pools. Everything looked prosperous. Everything looked successful. What most people saw was a neighborhood. What I saw was demand. Every shower, every sprinkler, every faucet, every swimming pool, every green lawn during a Texas summer. Demand. Water does not care about marketing brochures or property values. It follows mathematics. Supply and consumption. Recharge and withdrawal. That evening I opened one of my grandfather's old journals. A note written decades earlier caught my attention. Protect the water, and the land will protect itself. Simple words. Practical words. The kind of advice that only makes sense after enough years pass. Standing on my porch as darkness settled across the ranch, I listened to the pump start once again. The sound carried through the night air like a warning. Somewhere beneath my feet, the most valuable asset my family owned was under pressure. And for the first time, I was beginning to suspect that the problem was much larger than a mechanical failure. 3 days later, I decided to stop guessing and start measuring. The difference between suspicion and proof is data. Before sunrise, I loaded monitoring equipment into my truck and headed towards several observation wells scattered across the ranch. The air smelled of cedar and dry soil. A thin layer of fog hovered above low sections of pasture while the first light crept across the horizon. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked normal. Yet beneath the ground, something was changing. By mid-morning, I had gathered enough readings to confirm what I feared. Water levels were falling at different rates depending on their proximity to the subdivision. The closer a monitoring point sat to the development, the greater the decline. That pattern was impossible to ignore. Aquifers are complicated systems, but they leave fingerprints. Water moves according to geology, pressure, and demand. If enough water is withdrawn from one area, the effects begin to ripple outward. Looking at the numbers on my tablet screen, I could practically see the pressure cone forming beneath the development. Later that afternoon, I drove through the neighborhood for the first time in months. The place looked like a magazine advertisement. Fresh landscaping lined every street. Decorative fountains sparkled near the entrance. Green lawns stretched from sidewalk to sidewalk despite one of the hottest summers in recent memory. Children rode bicycles beneath rows of young trees, while automatic sprinklers sprayed water across perfectly maintained grass. The sound of those sprinklers followed me through the neighborhood. Click, hiss, rotate, click, hiss, rotate. Most people would not have noticed. I could not stop noticing. Every rotating sprinkler head represented groundwater being pulled from somewhere. Every lush lawn represented consumption. Every swimming pool represented demand. Near the community center, I spotted the largest water feature in the development. A decorative pond surrounded by walking trails and landscaping. Sunlight reflected across the surface while residents relaxed nearby. It looked beautiful. It also looked expensive to maintain. As I parked across the street, a maintenance worker adjusted irrigation controls beside a utility enclosure. Curious, I watched for a few minutes. Then I noticed something even more interesting. Several high-capacity pumps operating behind a fenced service area. Professional equipment. Larger than anything required for a small neighborhood park. My instincts immediately sharpened. That evening, I returned to my office and began comparing public records against groundwater reports. The deeper I dug, the more questions appeared. Construction permits, utility filings, development plans, population growth estimates. Everything pointed toward increasing water demand. Yet nowhere could I find a clear explanation for how the community expected to sustain that level of consumption long-term. Around midnight, surrounded by maps and monitoring reports, I leaned back in my chair and stared at a regional groundwater chart pinned to the wall. The answer was beginning to emerge. Not completely, not yet, but enough pieces were falling into place that I could see the outline of a much larger problem. Somewhere beneath those 80 houses, Someone was pulling far more water than they should have been. And if my calculations were correct, the situation was getting worse every single day. The following week brought temperatures above 100 degrees almost every afternoon. Heat shimmered above the highways. Lawns browned across the county. Ranchers discussed drought conditions at feed stores and gas stations. Yet every time I drove past the subdivision, the grass remained bright green. Sprinklers ran before sunrise and after sunset. Decorative ponds stayed full. Community landscaping looked untouched by the weather. The contrast bothered me more with each passing day. One morning, I parked near a public access road overlooking part of the development and watched maintenance crews move between utility buildings. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the hot air. Large irrigation zones activated in sequence across common areas. Water sprayed across acres of landscaping, while neighboring properties struggled to conserve every gallon they could. Back at my ranch, the situation continued to worsen. The pumps cycled more frequently. Pressure fluctuations became harder to ignore. My monthly electricity bill climbed because the equipment was working harder to reach the same output. None of those changes were catastrophic by themselves. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed in only one direction. Late one evening, I sat in my office surrounded by maps, monitoring reports, and groundwater models. The glow from my computer screen illuminated charts covering the walls. Outside, crickets filled the darkness with a constant chorus. Inside, I compared water level readings against development timelines. When I overlaid the data, the connection became impossible to dismiss. The steepest decline began shortly after the final phase of the subdivision opened. 80 homes, full occupancy, peak summer demand. The timing matched almost perfectly. The next morning, I filed requests for additional public utility records. Most arrived within days. Others required more digging. The deeper I went, the more inconsistencies appeared. Projected usage numbers did not align with actual demand. Infrastructure descriptions raised questions. Several filings referenced groundwater sources without clearly identifying long-term capacity limits. Nothing looked dramatic. Nothing looked obviously illegal. It was something more dangerous. Assumptions. Expensive assumptions. The kind that go unnoticed while everything appears to be working. A few days later, I met with another groundwater specialist at a regional water conference. We reviewed portions of the data over coffee between presentations. The convention center smelled of fresh paper, carpet cleaner, and roasted coffee beans. Engineers discussed reservoirs and pipelines around us. After studying the numbers, he tapped a chart showing declining groundwater elevations. If these measurements are accurate, he said, someone is pulling from the same aquifer far more aggressively than planners anticipated. That sentence stayed with me during the drive home. Aggressively. Not accidentally. Not temporarily. Aggressively. As sunset painted the sky red above the ranch, I stopped beside one of the observation wells and lowered a measuring device into the water column. The reading came back lower than the previous month. Lower again. Standing there in the fading light, I felt the last pieces beginning to connect. This was no longer a theory. Somewhere beneath that subdivision, enormous volumes of groundwater were being extracted every day. The question was no longer whether it was happening. The question was whether the people responsible understood exactly whose aquifer they were depending on. By the end of August, I stopped treating the situation like a theory and started treating it like an investigation. Every morning began the same way. I checked monitoring wells before sunrise. I reviewed pump logs over coffee. I compared groundwater levels against historical records that stretched back decades. The numbers never improved. If anything, they became more alarming. One afternoon, I loaded specialized monitoring equipment into my truck and spent 6 hours collecting measurements from locations surrounding the subdivision. The heat was brutal. Dust coated everything. The metal tools became almost too hot to touch. Yet the data made the effort worthwhile. For the first time, I could clearly map how pressure levels changed across different sections of the aquifer. The pattern was unmistakable. Groundwater drawdown increased dramatically as measurements approached the development. Later that evening, I spread maps across my dining room table. The smell of dust and old paper filled the room while a ceiling fan pushed warm air overhead. Colored markers identified monitoring points. Survey records covered every available surface. As I connected locations and measurements, a picture emerged that was impossible to ignore. The subdivision was not merely using groundwater. It was dominating groundwater demand throughout the area. The next breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. A public records request finally produced several utility documents I had been waiting weeks to receive. I opened the files shortly after dinner. At first, they seemed routine. Engineering summaries, infrastructure descriptions, capacity projections. Then I found something interesting buried inside a technical appendix. Estimated water usage figures. I read them twice, then a third time. According to the projections, actual demand should have remained significantly lower than what my measurements suggested. The difference was enormous. Either the estimates were wrong or actual consumption had grown far beyond original expectations. Neither possibility was good. The following week, I attended a regional groundwater board meeting 2 counties away. Most people there discussed permits, conservation measures, and infrastructure planning. To everyone else, it was another routine meeting. To me, it was an opportunity. During a break, I spoke with several specialists familiar with large residential developments. Without mentioning specific names, I described the conditions I was seeing. Every conversation led to the same conclusion. Somebody was extracting far more water than a healthy long-term system should support. Driving home that evening, I passed the subdivision just after sunset. Lights glowed from every home. Sprinklers activated across common areas. Decorative fountains continued flowing near the entrance. Residents walked along landscape trails beside ponds that reflected the fading sky. The neighborhood looked successful, comfortable, permanent. Yet I now understood something most of the homeowners probably did not. Everything they enjoyed depended on a resource hidden hundreds of feet beneath the surface. And that resource was showing signs of stress. When I reached the ranch, I stopped beside one of my observation wells and lowered the measuring tape again. The result came back lower than the previous reading. Lower again. I stood there listening to the distant hum of my pump while darkness settled across the pasture. Months earlier, I had wondered whether the subdivision might be connected to the problem. Now I knew it was. What I still did not know was whether the people running the homeowners association had any legal right to withdraw that much water in the first place. And that question was about to change everything. The answer arrived inside a cardboard box that looked completely ordinary. A week after my latest records request, several hundred pages of archived permitting documents showed up at my office. Most people would have seen paperwork. I saw the missing piece of a puzzle that had consumed months of my life. The smell of fresh printer ink mixed with old filing paper as I carried the box to my desk and started sorting through the contents. Engineering reports, environmental assessments, capacity projections, correspondence between consultants and regulatory agencies. Hour after hour, I worked through the stack. Outside, a late summer storm rolled across the ranch. Rain tapped against the windows while distant thunder echoed across the pasture. Inside, I kept reading. Around 8 that evening, I found the document that changed everything. At first glance, it looked insignificant. Just another technical filing buried among hundreds of pages. Then I noticed a series of groundwater assumptions referenced in the development approval process. I compared them against current usage estimates. Then I checked them against actual monitoring data. My stomach tightened. The numbers did not match. Not even close. I spent the next 2 hours verifying the calculations. Then I checked them again. Every review led to the same conclusion. The original planning documents assumed a level of groundwater demand that was dramatically lower than what the subdivision was now consuming. The difference was not minor. It was massive. The next morning, I called a water rights attorney whose firm specialized in groundwater disputes. 2 days later, I sat across from him in a conference room overlooking downtown Austin. The room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Sunlight reflected off nearby office towers as I spread maps and reports across the table. He listened carefully while I explained the monitoring results, the pressure decline, and the discrepancies in the development records. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds. Then he opened one of the permit files and pointed to a specific section. "Did anyone ever revisit these assumptions after full occupancy?" he asked. "Not that I can find," I replied. He nodded slowly. That could become a problem. It was the most understated sentence I had heard in months. Over the following weeks, his team reviewed every relevant filing connected to the subdivision. Engineers examined groundwater projections. Regulatory specialists analyzed permits. Hydrologists reviewed extraction patterns. The deeper they looked, the clearer the situation became. The community had been designed around expectations that no longer reflected reality. Demand had grown. Consumption had grown. Dependence on the aquifer had grown. Yet critical assumptions remained frozen in time. One afternoon, my attorney called while I was checking a monitoring well near the northern edge of the ranch. The wind carried the scent of approaching rain across the grasslands as I answered. His voice sounded unusually confident. "Cole," he said, "we found the weakness." I stood there staring across the pasture while he explained the details. For months I had been chasing symptoms. Falling water levels, increased pump activity, declining pressure. Now I finally understood the cause. The subdivision was not operating on a solid foundation of groundwater planning. It was operating on assumptions that should have been questioned years earlier. And for the first time since this started, I realized that the problem threatening my aquifer might also become the problem that brought the entire homeowners association to a standstill. Most people assume that the moment you discover a major problem, you immediately take action. Real life rarely works that way. The moment my attorney confirmed the weakness in the homeowners association's groundwater position, I could have started pushing for immediate intervention. Instead, I waited. That decision confused even some of the experts working with me. But groundwater systems do not care about emotions. Courts do not care about emotions. Evidence matters. Timing matters. Facts matter. If this was going to succeed, it had to be done correctly. September faded into October. Temperatures remained unusually high. Irrigation systems throughout the subdivision continued operating every day. Community pools remained full. Decorative ponds reflected the afternoon sunlight. New landscaping projects appeared near common areas. Every week seemed to bring another improvement, another expansion, another sign that the neighborhood expected unlimited access to water forever. Meanwhile, I continued collecting data. Every observation well on my ranch became part of the record. Every pressure reading, every groundwater measurement, every pump cycle. The growing stack of reports on my desk told a story far more convincing than any speech ever could. One afternoon, I drove past the subdivision after attending a county meeting. The neighborhood looked better than ever. Fresh flowers lined entrances. Newly planted trees stretched along walking paths. Sprinklers rotated across acres of perfectly maintained grass. Children played near the community pool while residents relaxed beside the water. Looking around, nobody would have guessed that nearly everything visible depended upon a resource under increasing strain. The irony was impossible to ignore. The more successful the development appeared, the more dependent it became. My attorney called several times during those months with updates. Regulatory reviews continued. Expert reports were completed. Legal filings moved forward quietly through the system. Each conversation ended the same way. We wait. We document. We build the strongest possible case. By November, even my own ranch was showing signs of stress. Pump efficiency had declined noticeably. Energy costs continued rising. Water levels remained lower than historical averages despite occasional rainfall. Every new reading reinforced the same conclusion. Excessive withdrawals were creating consequences beyond the subdivision itself. One evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset spread across the pasture. The air smelled of dry grass and approaching winter. In the distance, the familiar hum of my groundwater system drifted through the quiet. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the records he preserved for decades. I thought about the countless decisions he made to protect something most people never saw. Beneath the surface, the aquifer connected everything. The ranch, the wildlife, the neighboring properties, even the subdivision itself. People argued about ownership above ground all the time. Property lines, developments, roads, buildings. But underground, reality followed different rules. A few weeks later, my attorney delivered the update we had been waiting for. The final pieces were falling into place. Expert findings supported the data. Regulatory concerns had been documented. The legal foundation was complete. For months, the Homeowners Association had continued expanding its dependence on the aquifer while believing the future was secure. They never realized that every additional lawn, every additional water feature, and every additional demand placed on the system only strengthened the evidence being assembled against them. And as winter approached, I finally understood why patience had been the right decision. The longer they relied on the aquifer, the more difficult it would become for anyone to deny what the data had been showing all along. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late January. I was reviewing groundwater reports at my kitchen table when my attorney's name appeared on my phone screen. Outside, a cold wind moved across the pasture, rattling the bare branches of the cottonwood trees near the main well. The sky was gray, the kind of day that makes everything feel quiet before something important happens. I answered immediately. His voice carried a calm confidence I had learned to recognize over the previous several months. "The judge signed it," he said. For a moment, I simply stared out the window. Months of monitoring, months of reports, months of legal reviews and expert testimony. All of it had led to a single court order. The document required immediate restrictions on groundwater withdrawals connected to the subdivision until compliance issues could be addressed and reviewed. No dramatic speeches, no television cameras, just a judge reviewing evidence and making a decision. That evening, I drove past the development on my way home from town. Everything looked normal. Streetlights illuminated quiet roads. Families returned home from work. Decorative fountains continued flowing near the entrance. Residents walked dogs along landscape paths. Nobody seemed aware that a major change was already in motion. By sunrise the next morning, that changed. I woke before dawn and stepped onto my porch carrying a cup of coffee. The air was cold enough to see my breath. Across the ranch, the familiar sounds of morning slowly emerged. Birds stirred in the trees. Cattle moved through the pasture. The pump house sat silent for the first time in weeks. Not because it was broken, because it no longer needed to work as hard. Around 7 o'clock, my phone started vibrating. News had begun spreading throughout the subdivision. Emergency meetings were being scheduled. Community notices were being distributed. Water management protocols were being implemented. Certain high-volume uses faced immediate restrictions, while compliance reviews moved forward. Later that morning, I drove toward the development. The atmosphere felt completely different from every previous visit. Maintenance crews gathered near utility facilities. Residents stood in small groups discussing notices they had received. Community managers moved quickly between buildings carrying folders and tablets. Nobody looked angry. Most looked confused. They had purchased homes, not legal disputes. They had trusted that the infrastructure supporting their neighborhood had been planned correctly. Standing near the entrance, I watched one of the decorative fountains shut down. A small thing, almost meaningless by itself, yet it symbolized something much larger. For years, people assumed the aquifer could provide unlimited support for unlimited growth. Now reality had finally entered the conversation. Throughout the day, updates continued arriving from attorneys and regulatory officials. Compliance reviews would continue. Additional assessments would follow. Long-term solutions would need to be negotiated. But the most important fact remained unchanged. The court had acknowledged what the data had shown all along. By sunset, I returned to the ranch and walked toward the observation well nearest the property line. The winter sky glowed orange above the horizon. A cold breeze carried the scent of damp earth through the grass. Beneath my feet, the aquifer remained invisible, just as it always had. Yet for the first time in months, it felt like someone besides me finally understood its value. The months that followed felt different from anything that came before. For the first time since this entire situation began, I was no longer chasing answers. The answers already existed. Now everyone else had to catch up to them. Spring arrived slowly across the ranch. Fresh green grass replaced the winter brown. Wildflowers appeared along fence lines. The observation wells that had become part of my daily routine finally started showing encouraging signs. The declines had stabilized. Pressure levels improved. Recovery was not immediate, but recovery had begun. One morning I stood beside the main monitoring station with a clipboard in my hand and compared the latest readings against the numbers from the previous year. The difference was impossible to miss. The aquifer was responding. Beneath hundreds of feet of soil and rock, the system was finally getting a chance to breathe again. Meanwhile, the subdivision remained exactly where it had always been. The houses were still there. The roads were still there. Families still lived their lives. Children still rode bicycles through the neighborhood. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the part many people failed to understand. The goal had never been to hurt homeowners. The goal had been to force accountability. Over time, revised water management plans were implemented. Usage policies changed. Infrastructure improvements were proposed. Consultants who should have been asking hard questions years earlier were suddenly asking them every day. At one county meeting, I sat quietly in the back while officials discussed long-term groundwater sustainability. The room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper. Engineers reviewed charts projected onto large screens. Attorneys discussed compliance requirements. Nobody was celebrating. Nobody was arguing. People were finally doing the work that should have been done from the beginning. A few weeks later, I saw Diane Whitmore for the first time since the court order. She stood outside a community meeting speaking with residents beneath a bright spring sky. From a distance, she looked smaller somehow. Not physically, professionally. The confidence that once seemed unshakable had been replaced by caution. As I walked past, our eyes met briefly. Neither of us said much. There was nothing left to argue about. The data had spoken. The court had spoken. Reality had spoken. Driving home that afternoon, I followed the familiar road back to the ranch. The windows were down. Warm air carried the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers through the truck. In the distance, I could hear the steady rhythm of water moving through one of the stock ponds fed by the groundwater system. It sounded stronger than it had in a long time. When I reached the property, I parked beside the main well and sat for a while watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange across the horizon. The pump cycled normally. Not constantly. Not desperately. Normally. I thought about my grandfather's records. I thought about the years he spent protecting something most people never even knew existed. I thought about how close that knowledge came to being forgotten. Then I looked across the ranch and smiled. The subdivision had houses. The homeowners association had authority. The developers had money. But none of those things mattered as much as understanding the foundation they depended on. In the end, they believed they owned the future because they could see it above ground. What they never understood was that the future was hidden beneath their feet the entire time. And when the truth finally surfaced, it changed everything.